She stood at that altar, said, "I do," to a man who didn't know her real name, and somehow, in the middle of all that lying, found something real. But here's what nobody tells you about real things built inside lies. They cost you. He chose her. Openly. Without apology. And the moment he did, his family came for everything. His money. His name. His future. And they found someone else. Someone who is not innocent. Someone who wants what Zora has, and is willing to destroy her to get it. So the question is no longer whether he loves her. The question is, how much is love actually worth when everything else is on the line? Stay with me, because part 2 is where we find out. If you haven't watched part 1, go watch it first. The link is in the description. And if you're already here, subscribe, hit that bell, and don't you dare go anywhere. Let's get into it. The sun rose over Seoul like it always did. Indifferent, unhurried, unbothered by the lives being quietly dismantled inside one penthouse on the 42nd floor. Nobody had slept. Halmiani was the first one up, as she always was. She sat in her chair before the city had fully woken up below her, tea in hand, watching the light change over the skyline with the patience of a woman who had lived long enough to know that the morning always comes whether you are ready for it or not. She called all 3 of them together just after 7. They came, Hannah, Zora and Jisoo, still wearing the weight of the night before on their faces, sitting across from the old woman who had known the truth longer than any of them and chosen, in her own way, to let it play out. She did not lecture. She did not assign blame. She simply looked at each of them for a long, quiet moment and said what she had been waiting to say for longer than they knew. "I have spent my whole life making decisions for this family," she said quietly. "Some of them were right. Some of them I will carry to my grave." She paused, her hands folded in her lap the way they always were when she was saying something that mattered. "But I am done making decisions that belong to other people. Whatever happens next, it belongs to you. All 3 of you. Not to me." She stood slowly, smoothed the front of her hanbok, and walked out of the room. Just like that. The woman who had orchestrated everything, controlled everything, known everything, stepped back and left 3 young people sitting with the pieces of a story only they could finish. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Hannah looked at Zora across the room and smiled. Not a big smile, not a dramatic one, just the small quiet kind that carries more weight than anything loud ever could. "I'm going to him," she said simply. Zora looked at her sister. This woman she had known for less than a month, and somehow felt she had been waiting for her whole life. "Yeah," she said softly. "Yeah," Hannah said. "I should have gone a long time ago. I just needed to stop being afraid of what I'd have to leave behind to get there." She was packed within the hour. One suitcase, now carrying her forward into something that was entirely and finally hers. At the door, she pulled Zora into a hug that lasted longer than either of them expected. 2 sisters who had found each other in the most impossible circumstances, learning in real time what it felt like to simply be family. "Call me," Zora said into her shoulder. "Every day," Hannah said back. She walked out of the Lee penthouse with her head up and her shoulders back. Not running, not escaping, not borrowing anything from anyone. Just choosing. For the first time in her life. Simply and completely choosing. She was barely gone an hour when the lobby called up. 2 visitors. No appointment. Everyone in the penthouse knew who it was before the elevator doors opened. Chairman Kwon walked in like a man who had never once in his life needed to be invited anywhere. Broad shoulders, silver-streaked hair combed back, charcoal suit. Dark eyes that moved around the room once, and then settled on his son like everything else and it was irrelevant. Mrs. Kwon followed behind him. Navy tailored dress, pearl necklace, black hair in a sharp, elegant bob, expression set in that particular kind of composure that costs years to perfect. The formal sitting room felt smaller with them in it. Chairman Kwon did not sit. He stood in the center of the room and looked at his son the way a man looks at something he built that has stopped working the way he designed it to. "You have embarrassed this family," he said. His voice was low and completely controlled, which somehow made it worse than if he had shouted. "You have allowed yourself to be deceived, manipulated, and made into a joke in front of every family and soul that matters." Jisoo said nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and let his father speak. "This marriage is not real," Chairman Kwon continued. "It was signed by the wrong woman. Legally, morally, in every way that matters. It does not exist. And you are going to come home. You are going to let this be handled quietly, and you are going to move forward like a Kwon." Mrs. Kwon stepped forward then, her voice softer than her husband's, but carrying its own particular weight. "Jisoo," she said carefully, "we are not asking you to forget this happened. We are asking you to remember who you are and what this family has built. Come home. Let us handle this quietly. That is all we are asking." The room waited. Jisoo looked at his mother for a long moment, then at his father. Then he said the only thing he had known since the moment he stood in that confrontation room the night before, with the truth finally laid bare between all of them. "No." One word. Quiet as everything else in that room. But it landed like something thrown from a very great height. Chairman Kwon studied his son for a long moment. Not with anger, but with the cold, steady look of a man who has just decided to change his strategy. "Then we are done here," he said simply. "For now." He turned and walked out. Mrs. Kwon followed, pausing just briefly at the doorway, her dark eyes moving once to Zora, who was standing quietly at the far end of the room, then back to her son. She said nothing, but the look she gave Zora before she turned away said everything her husband had been too controlled to say out loud. The penthouse was quiet again. Jisoo stood in the center of the formal sitting room for a moment. Alone, the city spread out behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows like it had been there the whole time. Watching. Then he went to find Zora. She was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't drunk, staring out at the skyline. She had heard everything. The walls in this penthouse had never been particularly good at keeping secrets. He didn't say anything when he walked in. He simply crossed the kitchen and pulled her close, one arm around her shoulders, his chin coming to rest on top of her head. And they stood like that for a long time without either of them speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said that they didn't already know. When he finally stepped back, he looked at her directly, the way he always looked at her, like he was seeing something the rest of the world kept missing. "I have to go back there tonight," he said quietly. "Not because I agree with him, because I am not going to run from this. I am going to stand in the middle of it and not move." Zora nodded slowly. Her hands found the lapels of his jacket and held on for just a moment. "I know," she said. He covered her hands with his and held them there. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "Not really." She believed him. He kissed her forehead. Slow, deliberate, certain. Then picked up his bag from the hallway where he had left it and walked to the elevator. She stood in the hallway long after the elevator doors had closed, one hand pressed flat against the wall beside her. The penthouse quiet around her, soul glittering through every window. She had come here 3 weeks ago to borrow someone else's life. She was still here, still herself. And somehow, in the middle of all the chaos and the lies and the impossible complications, she had found something that belonged entirely to her. She just had to figure out how to keep it. The Kwon family estate sat on the quieter side of Seoul, the kind of neighborhood where the houses didn't need to announce themselves because their silence did it for them. High walls, manicured grounds, rooms that had been designed not for living in, but for impressing people who came to visit. Jisoo had grown up inside those walls. He knew every corridor, every expectation, every unspoken rule that governed how Kwon was supposed to move through the world. He had spent 31 years learning the shape of this place and fitting himself into it without complaint. Walking back through those gates that evening felt different than it ever had before, like he was entering somewhere he no longer fully belonged. His father was waiting for him in the main sitting room. Not the casual family room, but the formal one. the one reserved for meetings that mattered. Chairman Kwon was seated at the head of the long table, jacket still on, posture still perfect, like the hours between the penthouse and now had not touched him at all. Mrs. Kwon sat to his right, hands folded, pearl necklace catching the light. Jisoo sat across from them. Nobody offered tea. Chairman Kwon opened without preamble. The way he opened every meeting that he had already decided the outcome of before it began. "The Lee merger is finished," he said. "That chapter is closed and we are not reopening it. What we are going to discuss tonight is what happens next. For this family. For your future. And for the Kwon name." Jisoo said nothing. He listened. "We have identified a new alliance," Chairman Kwon continued. "The Shin family. You know who they are." Jisoo knew exactly who they were. The Shin family controlled 3 of the largest media companies in Korea and had political connections that reached into places most business families could only dream of. They were not just wealthy. They were the kind of powerful that shaped conversations before they happened. "Chairman Shin has a daughter," Mrs. Kwon said, her voice measured and careful. "Mina. She is accomplished, well-regarded, and from everything we have discussed with the Shin family, she is open to this arrangement. A marriage between you and Mina would give this family something the Lee merger never could. Influence. Real influence. The kind that protects everything we have built, not just now, but for the next generation." Jisoo looked at his mother for a long moment. "You have already spoken to them," he said. It was not a question. "We have had preliminary conversations." "Yes," Chairman Kwon said without apology. "We did not need your permission to explore options for this family's future." "And what exactly are the conditions?" Jisoo asked quietly. "Let me hear them." Chairman Kwon leaned forward slightly, just slightly, the way a man leans when he wants you to understand that what he is about to say is not negotiable. "First," he said, "the annulment of the current marriage is handled immediately and quietly. Our legal team has already drafted the paperwork. It requires only your signature." Jisoo's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Second," Chairman Kwon continued, "you end all contact with the woman from the Lee household. Completely. No calls, no visits, no public appearances together. She was part of a deception that embarrassed this family, and she is not to be part of our world going forward." Mrs. Kwon's eyes moved to her son's face carefully, reading him the way she always had. Looking for the crack, the softening, the moment he would fold the way he had always folded before. She didn't find it. "Third," Chairman Kwon said, "you will be formally introduced to Mina at a family dinner at the end of this month. You will approach this with an open mind and the respect that the Shin family deserves. We are not asking you to fall in love overnight. We are asking you to be a Kwon." He sat back. "In return," he said, "everything remains as it has always been. Your position in the company, your access to the family accounts, your name, your future, all of it intact. Exactly as it would have been had none of this happened." He folded his hands on the table in front of him. "And if I refuse?" Jisoo said. The room went very quiet. Chairman Kwon's expression did not change. Not even slightly. "If you refuse," he said slowly, "you will be removed from your position in the company effective immediately. Your access to all family accounts will be frozen. The apartment, the cars, the professional connections that carry the Kwon name. All of it gone. You will have your salary from the past month, and whatever you have managed to save personally." He paused. "And you will no longer be introduced publicly as my son in any capacity that relates to this family's business or reputation." The words fell into the room one by one like stones dropped into still water. Mrs. Kwon looked at her son across the table with something in her eyes that was almost, but not quite, an apology. "We love you, Jisoo," she said quietly. "This is not punishment. This is the reality of the world we live in and the family you were born into. We are asking you to choose your future." Jisoo sat with everything his parents had just laid on the table in front of him. the conditions, the consequences, the carefully constructed ultimatum wrapped in the language of love and legacy. He thought about Zora standing in that hallway with her hand pressed flat against the wall after he left. He thought about the kitchen, the cooking spoon, the moment something real had found him inside a lie. He thought about what it had felt like, for the first time in 31 years, to be seen by someone who had no reason to see him as anything other than exactly what he was. He stood up slowly. "I heard everything you said," he told his parents quietly. "I will think about it." He walked out of the formal sitting room, through the corridor he had grown up in, and up to the bedroom that had been his since childhood, now feeling like a room that belonged to a version of him that no longer quite existed. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Then he picked up his phone and called Zora. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me everything," she said. And he did. "Yes," he said. "And cut off all contact with me." "Yes." Another silence. "And marry someone else." "That is what he said." Zora exhaled slowly. Not dramatically. Just the long, quiet breath of someone processing something too big to swallow all at once. "Jisoo," she said carefully. "That is everything. That is your entire life they're putting on the table." "I know," he said. "I need you to understand what that actually means," she said. "Not in the way you say you understand when you are standing in front of me and I am right there. I need you to sit in that room by yourself tonight and actually think about what it means to walk away from all of that. The company, the money, your family name, everything your father just described." "I already know what it means," he said. "Then tell me," she said quietly, "because I need to hear you say it out loud. Not for me, for you." He was quiet for a moment. "It means starting over," he said. "From nothing that was handed to me. Building something that is actually mine." He paused. "It means losing my father's version of my life and figuring out what my own version looks like." Another pause, shorter this time. "And it means keeping you." The line was quiet again. "I am not worth all of that," Zora said softly. "That is not your decision," he said simply. She didn't have an answer for that. And he didn't need her to. They stayed on the phone for another hour after that, not always talking, sometimes just existing in the same silence from opposite sides of the city, which was its own kind of conversation. Before they said good night, Jisoo told her one more thing. "I am going to tell them tomorrow," he said. "Properly. Face to face. So they understand that this is not confusion or emotion or something that is going to change with time. I want them to hear it clearly." "Okay," Zora said. "Okay," he said back. He slept better that night than he had any right to. The next morning Jisoo came downstairs before breakfast was served and found both his parents already in the dining room. His father reading through documents at the head of the table, his mother pouring tea with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had run a household of this size for 30 years without ever needing to be asked. He sat down across from his father and waited until Chairman Kwon looked up. "I have thought about what you said," Jisoo began. His father set the documents down and gave him his full attention. The kind of full attention that felt less like listening and more like preparing a counter-argument. "I appreciate that you believe you are protecting this family," Jisoo said carefully. "I understand the weight of what you built and what you want to preserve. I am not dismissing any of that." Mrs. Kwon set her teacup down slowly. "But I am not signing the annulment," Jisoo said. "I am not cutting off contact with Zora. And I'm not going to sit across from another family's daughter and pretend I am available when I am not." He kept his voice even and quiet. Not defiant, not emotional, just clear. The clearest he had ever been about anything in his life. "That is my answer. And it is not going to change." Chairman Kwon looked at his son for a long time without speaking. The dining room was very quiet. Morning light coming through the windows. Tea cooling in the cups. 31 years of a particular kind of relationship sitting in the space between a father and a son who were finally, honestly, seeing each other clearly for the first time. "You understand what this means," Chairman Kwon said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," Jisoo said. "You told me very clearly last night." His father nodded once. Slow, deliberate, final. "Then there is nothing more to discuss," he said. He picked up his documents and returned to them as if the conversation had already been filed away, somewhere it would not need to be revisited. Mrs. Kwon looked at her son across the table. And for just one unguarded moment, before she composed herself back into the woman she had spent decades becoming, something moved across her face that looked very much like grief. "I hope you know what you are doing," she said quietly. "For the first time in my life," Jisoo said gently, "I actually do." He pushed back his chair, stood up, and walked away from the breakfast table, away from the documents and the pearl necklace and the 31 years of a life that had been designed for him by people who loved him in the only way they knew how. He pulled out his phone as he walked down the corridor toward his room and typed a single message to Zora. "I told them. It's done. I'll see you soon." Her reply came back in less than a minute. "I'll put the kettle on." He smiled for the first time in 2 days. The Kwon family did not accept defeat quietly. That was never their way. Chairman Kwon had not built one of Seoul's most powerful construction empires by walking away from a collapsed deal and calling it finished. He walked away from collapsed deals and immediately began building better ones. It was simply how he was wired. Setback as strategy, loss as redirection. Within days of Jisoo's answer at the breakfast table, the Kwon family had already made their next move. Her name was Mina Shin. She arrived in Jisoo's life the way calculated people always arrive. Not loudly, not obviously, but through a series of carefully engineered coincidences that were never coincidences at all. A family dinner at the Kwon estate to which Jisoo was told to come home for. Just dinner. Nothing formal, his mother had said on the phone. A guest he hadn't been told about already seated at the table when he walked in. An introduction so smoothly handled that a less perceptive man might have genuinely believed it was accidental. Jisoo was not a less perceptive man. He knew exactly what he was looking at the moment he walked into that dining room and found Mina Shin seated to his mother's right, wearing a structured cream blazer and a smile that had clearly been prepared for this moment well in advance. Mina was striking in the way that people who put enormous effort into their appearance can be. Every detail considered. Nothing left to chance. Fair skin. Dark eyes that moved around a room with quiet calculation. Black hair falling in a sleek straight sheet past her shoulders. She carried herself with the particular confidence of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was exactly what powerful men were looking for, and had decided to use that as a tool rather than question it. She stood when Jisoo entered and extended her hand. "Jisoo," she said warmly, as if they were already on familiar terms. "I have heard so much about you." He shook her hand briefly and sat down. Dinner was a performance, and everyone at that table knew their role except Jisoo, who had decided before he sat down that he was not going to play his. He was polite. He was not cold. But he was also not present in the way his parents needed him to be. Not leaning in, not laughing at the right moments, not giving Mina the openings she kept carefully and elegantly constructing throughout the meal. Mina noticed. Of course she noticed. She was far too sharp to miss it. But Mina Shin had not grown up in one of Seoul's most strategic families without learning how to play a long game. One dinner was not a defeat. One dinner was simply information. She filed away everything she observed that evening. The way Jisoo checked his phone once under the table and almost smiled at whatever he saw there. The way his posture changed when his father spoke directly to him. The specific quality of his silence when her name was mentioned in the context of the future the Kwon family was building. She had dealt with more complicated situations than a man who was already in love with someone else. She simply needed to change the equation. What Jisoo did not know, what none of them in that penthouse across the city knew yet, was that Mina had already done her research long before that dinner. She knew about the twin switch. She knew about Zora. She knew about the marriage contract and the scandal and the 3 weeks that had turned a borrowed life into something neither sister had planned for. She had read every leaked detail, cross-referenced every rumor, and built herself a comprehensive picture of exactly what she was walking into. And she had decided that Zora was a problem she intended to solve. Not loudly. Not obviously. Mina was too smart for obvious. She began small. A carefully worded comment to a journalist she trusted. Nothing attributable, just enough to keep the twin switch story alive in the press cycle a little longer than it would have naturally stayed. A reminder to the public that the woman currently attached to Jisoo Kwon had walked into a family under a false name and a borrowed identity. The story ran 2 days later. Zora saw it from the Lee penthouse on a Tuesday morning. Her name in a headline she hadn't been warned about. The details of the switch laid out with just enough specific accuracy to feel authoritative and just enough editorial framing to make her look calculated rather than complicated. She set her phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood very still for a moment. Then she picked it back up and called Jisoo. He answered immediately. "I saw it," he said before she could speak. "How did they get those details?" she asked quietly. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I am going to find out." "Jisoo, I am coming over tonight," he said firmly. "Don't read anything else today. I mean it." She almost told him not to. Almost told him it was fine, that she was fine, that he didn't need to cross the city in the middle of everything his family was already putting him through just to sit with her in a kitchen and tell her things she already knew. But the truth was she wanted him to come. And she was tired of pretending that wanting things was something she needed to apologize for. "Okay," she said. He came that evening. No suit, just dark trousers and a simple shirt. The version of Jisoo that existed outside of family expectations and public appearances. He brought food from a place near the Kwon estate that she had mentioned once, weeks ago, that she wanted to try. He had remembered. They ate at the kitchen counter. The same kitchen where everything had started. And talked about everything and nothing the way people do when they're trying to give each other a few hours of ordinary inside an extraordinary situation. Before he left, he held her face in both hands and looked at her the way he always did. Like she was the clearest thing in a very complicated picture. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "we deal with it together. You are not reading those headlines alone. You are not carrying any of this by yourself. Do you understand me?" Zora looked at him for a long moment. "I understand you," she said. He kissed her, slow and certain. The kind of kiss that is less about the moment and more about everything it is standing in for. Then he left, and Zora stood in the kitchen alone, the city lights of Seoul glittering through the window above the counter, thinking about a woman she had never met who was sitting somewhere across this city, building something aimed directly at her. She didn't know Mina's name yet, but she could feel the shape of what was coming. The weeks that followed were a slow and deliberate kind of war. Not the loud kind. No confrontations in public, no dramatic scenes, no moments that announced themselves as turning points while they were happening. This was the quiet kind of war. The kind fought through carefully placed stories and engineered appearances and the slow, steady application of pressure on every side of a person until they either break or decide they won't. Chairman Kwon moved first on the professional front. He began quietly. A phone call here, a withdrawn introduction there. A business connection that had always been facilitated through the Kwon name suddenly becoming unavailable. Jisoo felt it before he fully understood what was happening. Doors that had always been open to him began to close. Not with a slam, but with the soft, quiet click of people who had received a message they weren't going to repeat out loud. His father was making good on his promise without making a single public statement. At the Kwon estate, the atmosphere had shifted into something colder and more formal than anything Jisoo had grown up with. Meals were quiet. His mother was present but distant. Not cruel. Never cruel. But carefully maintaining a space between them that felt designed to remind him what he was choosing over. Chairman Kwon moved through the house like a man who had already made his peace with the outcome and was simply waiting for his son to arrive at the same conclusion through exhaustion, if not through reason. Mina, meanwhile, was escalating. The press stories continued. Small, consistent, each one adding another layer to the public narrative she was building around Zora. Nothing so extreme that it could be directly attributed to her. Nothing so false that it could be cleanly disproved. Just a steady drip of framing. The twin switch, the false identity, the question of what kind of woman walks into a family under someone else's name and stays. She had also begun making herself more visible in Jisoo's world. Showing up at events she knew the Kwon family would attend. Being photographed in the right places at the right times. Allowing the press to draw the connections she was too smart to draw herself. To the outside world a picture was forming. Jisoo Kwon moving on from a scandal, a suitable and impressive woman waiting in the wings, a family finding its footing again after an embarrassment. It was fiction. But it was very convincing fiction. Jisoo saw through every move she made. He said nothing publicly, not yet. He was not ready to go public in a way that could be picked apart or misread. When he did, he wanted it to land exactly right. But the silence was costing him. Because Zora was watching. She didn't say much about the press coverage when he came to see her. And he came as often as he could, twice a week minimum, sometimes more. She was warm when he was there. She laughed. She cooked badly and let him fix it. She fell asleep against his shoulder on the couch on a Thursday evening, watching something neither of them was paying attention to. But he noticed the way she would go quiet sometimes when she thought he wasn't watching. The way she would pick up her phone and put it back down without reading what was on the screen. The way she sometimes looked at him with something behind her eyes that she wasn't saying out loud. She was holding something. And she was holding it alone because she didn't want to add to what he was already carrying. That was so entirely her that it made his chest hurt. Then Mina overplayed her hand. It happened on a Friday. A story appeared. Not in a gossip column this time, but in one of Seoul's more respected lifestyle publications, which gave it a weight the previous pieces hadn't carried. It was framed as an insider account of the twin switch scandal and its aftermath. And buried inside it, presented as fact, was a claim that Zora had known about the arranged marriage before she agreed to the switch, that she had seen an opportunity in her sister's wealth and position and had made a calculated decision to insert herself into a life that could benefit her financially. It was a lie. A specific, deliberate, carefully constructed lie. The kind that is most dangerous precisely because it contains just enough proximity to a complicated truth to make it difficult to simply dismiss. Zora read it alone in the Lee penthouse on a Friday morning. She read it once. Then she set her phone down on the kitchen table and sat very still for a long time. She was not a woman who broke easily. She had grown up carrying things. Her mother's medical bills, her own debt and circumstances, the particular weight of a life that had never offered her much room to breathe. She knew how to hold difficulty without letting it show. But this was different. This was someone, a specific, intentional someone. Looking at her life and her choices and the most complicated and real thing she had ever found herself in the middle of, and deciding to reduce it to greed, to make her the villain of her own story. She sat at that kitchen table for a long time. Then she called Jisoo. He answered on the first ring. She didn't say hello. She just said, "I think we should stop." The line went completely quiet. "Zora, I mean it," she said. Her voice was steady. That was the thing about Zora. She didn't fall apart loudly. She just went very, very calm. "I have been watching you lose things for weeks. Your professional connections. Your relationship with your parents. Your name in the press. And now they are coming after mine too, and she stopped. Took a breath. "I don't know how to keep watching this, and feel like I am not the reason for all of it. You are not the reason. Jisoo." She said his name quietly, but it stopped him completely. "I need you to hear me. Not to fix it. Just to hear me." He was quiet. "I came here with nothing," she said. "I had nothing to lose. You had everything. And piece by piece I have watched you put it all on the line for something that started as a lie that I was part of. And I don't." Her voice dropped slightly. "I don't know if I am worth all of that. I genuinely don't know." The line was quiet for a long moment. When Jisoo spoke, his voice was completely calm. Not the controlled calm of his father. A different kind. The kind that comes from being completely certain. "I'm going to say one thing," he said, "and then I'm getting in my car." She waited. "You do not get to decide what you are worth to me," he said. "That is not how this works." He hung up. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand and the city spread out through the window in front of her and waited. 40 minutes later the lobby called up. One visitor. She already knew who it was before she answered. She opened the door before he knocked. She had heard the elevator. She had been standing in the hallway for the last 30 seconds telling herself she wasn't going to cry, and mostly believing it. Jisoo stood in the doorway. No jacket, car keys still in his hand. The particular look on his face of a man who had driven across Seoul with one singular focus and arrived exactly where he intended to be. He stepped inside. She stepped back to let him in. The door closed behind him. They stood in the hallway for a moment. The same hallway where he had kissed her forehead and told her he wasn't going anywhere weeks ago, before any of this had escalated into what it had become. "Sit down with me," he said quietly. They sat in the living room. Not across from each other the way people sit when they are about to have a difficult conversation, but side by side on the couch, close enough that their shoulders were touching, which felt important. He didn't launch into anything. He didn't have a speech prepared. He simply turned to look at her and said, "Tell me what you are actually feeling. Not what you think you should feel. Not what you think is fair to me. What you actually feel." Zora looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. "I feel like I walked into someone else's life," she said slowly. "And I found something real in it. Something I didn't expect and didn't plan for and don't know how to protect." She paused. "And I feel like the harder I hold on to it, the more it costs you. And I don't know how to be worth that cost. I don't know how to look at everything you are losing and feel like I am enough reason for it." Jisoo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you what I see when I look at this situation?" She nodded. "I see a woman who came here with nothing and gave everything," he said. "Who wore a name that wasn't hers and carried a weight that wasn't hers, and somehow, inside all of that, managed to be more herself than anyone in this city who has had every advantage I have ever had." He paused. "I see someone who makes me feel like the version of myself I actually want to be. Not the version my father designed. Not the version that fits the Kwon name and the Kwon legacy and the Kwon idea of what a future should look like." He looked at her directly. "I see you. And I have been seeing you since that kitchen. Since the cooking spoon and the quiet and the moment you looked up at me like you were surprised I was actually there." Zora looked at him for a long time. "Your father is going to cut you off," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "You are going to lose the company. The accounts. Everything that has had your family name behind it." "I know," he said again. "And you are still sitting here." "I am still sitting here," he said simply, "because none of those things are the thing I am most afraid of losing." The room was very quiet. Outside the Seoul skyline glittered on. Indifferent and unhurried. The way it always was, the way it had been through all of this from the very beginning. Zora reached over and took his hand. He held it. 3 days later, Jisoo went public. Not with a press conference. Not with a dramatic statement designed for maximum impact. Just a single post. Direct, calm, written entirely in his own words without a publicist or a lawyer or anyone from the Kwon family having any knowledge of it before it went live. He confirmed the twin switch. He confirmed the marriage. He confirmed that the woman he had married was not the woman he had been contracted to marry, and that somewhere in the middle of that impossible situation, he had found something he had not been looking for and was not willing to give back. He named Zora. Not as a footnote, as the reason. He addressed the story that had painted her as calculating and financially motivated in one sentence, calling it false, specific, and beneath the standard of the publication that had run it. And then he said simply that he was stepping away from the Kwon family business arrangements and building something of his own. And that he was doing it with complete clarity and no regrets. He posted it at 7 in the morning and put his phone face down on the desk. By 9 the statement had been shared 40,000 times. By noon, Chairman Kwon had followed through on every promise he had made at that dining room table. Jisoo's access to the company accounts was frozen. His position at the Kwon Corporation was formally dissolved. The cars, the corporate memberships, the professional introductions that had always carried the weight of the Kwon name behind them. All of it gone with the quiet efficiency of a family that had been prepared for this outcome and had the infrastructure to execute it without breaking stride. Jisoo packed what was his: clothes, his laptop, a few things from his childhood room that actually meant something, into 2 bags and walked out of the Kwon estate for the last time. He did not look back. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. 20 years of a particular kind of life does not dissolve without leaving something behind. A grief that sits alongside the relief. A complicated love for people who loved you in ways that were never quite the right shape. But he kept walking. Mina's carefully constructed campaign collapsed faster than she had built it. The morning after Jisoo's statement, the narrative shifted entirely. And in a media landscape that moves as fast as souls, the story of a man walking away from his family's empire for love was far more compelling than the story of a scandal that everyone had already been reading about for weeks. Mina found herself suddenly on the wrong side of public sympathy without having made a single attributable move, which was almost impressive in its way. The Shin family withdrew from the Kwon arrangement quietly and quickly, which was the only smart move left available to them. Mina said nothing publicly. She simply disappeared from the story the way calculated people disappear when a plan has failed. Efficiently and without acknowledgement. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after everything had finally settled into something resembling stillness, Zora's phone rang. Hannah. She answered immediately. "Tell me everything," Hannah said. And Zora could hear it in her voice before a single detail was shared. She was happy. Genuinely, fully, finally happy. The kind of happy that doesn't need to announce itself because it is already present in every syllable. They talked for an hour. Zora told her everything: Mina, the press stories, Jisoo's statement, the Kwon family following through, all of it. Hannah listened the way she always listened. Carefully, completely. And now? Hannah asked when Zora finished. And now, Zora said, looking out the penthouse window at the city below. "I think we are going to be okay." "You think?" Hannah said. Zora smiled. "We are going to be okay." Hannah laughed. Warm and real and free. "Good," she said. "Because you deserve okay. You deserve more than okay." They said goodbye the way sisters say goodbye when they know the next call is not far away. Easily, without ceremony, like something that will simply continue. Jisoo showed up at the Lee penthouse that same evening. One bag over his shoulder. No announcement. He had texted ahead. A single message that said simply, "Is the kettle on?" She had replied, "It's on." She opened the door when he knocked, and they stood for a moment in the doorway. This doorway that had seen so much of this story, that had been the site of arrivals and departures and truths and silences, and one very significant knock on a Tuesday evening that had started all of this. He looked at her. She looked at him. No lies between them. No borrowed names. No family pressure standing in the hallway with them. No contract, no merger, no arrangement disguised as something it wasn't. Just two people who had found each other in the most complicated way imaginable, and had chosen, every single day since the moment they found each other, to stay. "Come in," she said. He did. The door closed behind him. She turned from the door, and he was already there. Right there, no space between them. One hand coming up to rest against her face the way it had in that kitchen weeks ago, when neither of them had planned for any of this to become what it had become. He kissed her. Not the careful, hesitant kind from the kitchen. Not the formal kind from the altar. This one was different. This one carried everything that had happened between that first stolen moment and this one. Every phone call, every press story, every morning she had woken up wondering if it was going to hold. Every evening he had driven across the city just to sit beside her and remind her that it was. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't need to be described, because anyone who has ever fought hard for something real and finally had it in their hands knows exactly what it feels like. When they finally pulled apart, she looked up at him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. They didn't need to. And outside, Seoul glittered on. The way it always did. The way it always would. Indifferent to the lives inside one penthouse on the 42nd floor. But inside that penthouse, for the first time since any of this had begun, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.